and welcome to writing lesson number 2. Our learning targets for today are: I can recall the definitions of fragment, sentence, and run-on, identify a group of words as a fragment, sentence, or run-on, and recall and apply methods of fixing fragments and run-ons. Now, when we write, there are things that we need to try to be aware of and some different mistakes that we should try to avoid. Can you think of what those two things might be? Fragments and run-ons. When trying to remember the differences among fragments, sentences, and run-ons, students can use the story Goldilocks and the Three Bears as an analogy. So think about Baby Bear's bed. It was too small. It was not enough. So think about, out of fragment, sentence, or run-on, which term would this be like? It'd be like a fragment. So the fragment is not large enough. It has something missing. It has you wanting more. Then I want you to think about Papa Bear's bed. Papa Bear's bed is too big. It's too much. We don't need that much. So which term is that like? Well, that would be like a run-on. There's just too much. We need to make it smaller. It's just unnecessary. And then lastly, I want you to think about Mama Bear's bed. Mama Bear's bed is just right. It is exactly the correct size. It has everything that you need. This would be like a sentence. Very good. So when you're trying to think about maybe looking at a group of words to identify whether it is a fragment, sentence, or run-on, think about whether it's too small, just right, or too much, and that'll help you figure out which term it would be. And then also, as we write, we can look back and see the requirements to make sure that we're writing sentences and not fragments or run-ons. All right, so think back to writing lesson number 1. We discussed the characteristics that a group of words must possess in order to be considered a sentence. So let's go back and review those. It must have a subject, have a verb, and it must make sense standing alone. So that's another way that you can determine whether something is a fragment, a sentence, or a run-on. If it's missing any of these requirements, whether it's one or all three, it would be a fragment. If it has 3 out of the 3, it would be a sentence. And if it has too many of these things, then it would be a run-on. So let's talk about the definition of a fragment. A fragment is a group of words that does not possess all of the requirements to be considered a sentence. So one analogy that you can think of, or maybe a visual that you can get, would be like a broken bone. So when you break a bone, part of the bone breaks off from the main part. It's a fragment, or you might even call that like a fracture. So that would be like a fragment. So when a group of words does not possess all of those the 3 out of 3 requirements, it's going to be a fragment. Again, it's too small. It doesn't have all of the main parts that we need. Now, warning, sometimes a fragment may be capitalized, and it may also have end punctuation like a sentence. However, if it does not meet the 3 requirements of a sentence, it will be a fragment. So sometimes when people are writing, they may think that something is a sentence, so they may capitalize and punctuate like it is, but you have to look for those 3 requirements. Now that we know how to identify fragments, we need to know how to fix them. Now, there are 2 main ways to fix a fragment, and if you think about it, in some ways, it'll be similar to how you would fix a broken bone. So the first part, I want you to think, also you can even think about Bob the Builder. He's going to help us to fix our fragments here. So the first part is to add the part or parts that is or are missing. And then the second part would be to attach it to a nearby sentence. So the first one would be add the part or parts that is or are missing. So we know that a sentence must have a subject, a verb, maybe it's something, there's like a word or words that will help to make it make sense, and it's missing those. So if you will just add those parts, then it'll help to make the sentence complete. Another thing that we need to make sure to do, we need to make sure that it has a capital letter at the beginning and an end punctuation mark at the end. So we have all of those requirements, then that'll help it to be a sentence. Now, another way to fix a fragment would be to attach it to a nearby sentence. And one way that makes me think of this is if you have a broken bone, a lot of time they'll put the bones back together and then they'll add something to kind of help it to heal, like a sling or something like that. So sometimes, like you said, you might have to add something to help it, but it needs something to help it work. It can't be broken off by itself. It has to be attached back on. So again, that little analogy there of putting the pieces back together. So first, look around, maybe either before or after, and try to find a sentence that maybe it should go with, and make sure that that sentence, that part relates back to that sentence. And then if necessary, like we said in the first one, you might need to add words to make sure that the sentence makes sense. All right. So now that was fragments. Now we're ready to do the flip side, which would be when we have too much, that's going to be a run-on. And I find that this is probably the most common mistake that students in the grade levels that I teach make. Sometimes they make fragments, but most of the time they have trouble identifying the run-ons. So a run-on is a group of words that possesses too many of the characteristics required in order to be considered a sentence. So thinking about an analogy or a visual, think about a little speech bubble or someone saying blah, blah, blah. Or I always think of a movie called Dude, Where's My Car? And they go to order at a fast food restaurant, and when they finish, the woman says, and then, and they keep going, and she says, and then, and at some point they say, no, and then, because you don't just keep going. But sometimes when people speak or when they write, they are using run-ons, because every once in a while you need to stop, let the reader pause, maybe put a punctuation mark. So sometimes that blah, blah, blah is a really good analogy. So think about if a group of words contains two or more sentences that have been joined together, but it hasn't been done so properly, then it's going to be a run-on. So we will discuss the proper ways that you can put sentences together, but if it doesn't do it with the correct conventions, with proper punctuation or grammar, capitalization or whatnot, it's going to be a run-on. So again, a warning. Two or more sentences are often improperly combined. Sometimes people will use a conjunction like and, or sometimes the person will just put a comma, but there must be a comma and a conjunction to avoid being a run-on. So if you ever see that happening, you think to yourself, a comma is not strong enough, or a conjunction is not strong enough. They have to work together to make the sentence proper. And so one analogy that I'll steal from one of my co-teachers, Miss Colley, she says, a comma is not strong enough. It either needs something from beside it or up above it to help it out. So something beside it would be that conjunction, like a comma and, or something up above it would be like the top part of a semicolon to make it strong enough. So again, if you use a comma to join two things together, I think that's not going to be strong enough. You either need something beside it or up above it. That's a great thing to help us remember. Now that we know how to identify run-ons, now we need to know how to fix them. So there are three main ways to fix a run-on. First, use an end mark and a capital letter. Second, use a comma and a conjunction. And third, use a semicolon. All right, so for the first one, number one, use an end mark and a capital letter. Remember, there are three options for an end punctuation mark, and that would be a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point. So those are like our sentence ending team. So remember to use one of those, and then after we end the first sentence, then we have to make sure to capitalize the second sentence. So an example, if someone were to join these two sentences together with a comma or a conjunction, or maybe just nothing at all, we would need to put a period and a capital letter to separate. Like, I like soccer, period. It is one of my favorite hobbies. So that's sometimes the simplest way to fix a run-on is just to put an end mark and a capital letter. The second option is to join two related sentences with a comma and a conjunction. So you can kind of remember there's like the CC, and as we said before, the comma can use something from beside it, which would be a conjunction. So you want to use, in this case, a coordinating conjunction, and remember that acronym that we use. Can you say it with me? It's FANBOYS, which represents for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So example, let's say I was talking about Katie and her characteristics. I would say Katie is smart, comma, and she is well behaved, period. So using that comma in a conjunction, that joins our two related sentences together to form a compound. And in this particular case, the conjunction and works. Don't be tempted to use the word and all the time. These different conjunctions convey different meanings, so choose which one works best for you, your situation. And the last one, remember we said that a comma needs something either beside it or up above it. Well, this would be the up above it. You turn your comma into a semicolon. So I like this little meme here. It says the semicolon, not just for winky faces, because back before there were emojis, when you texted, the way that you would form a winky face would be with the left side of a parentheses and a semicolon. But you can also use a semicolon to join two closely related sentences to make a compound sentence. So a little thing that you need to know, when you use a semicolon, do not capitalize the beginning of the second sentence. That's kind of the cool thing about using a semicolon is it's not necessary. And here's an example of two closely related sentences. I like broccoli, semicolon, I do not like cauliflower. So again, talking about the likes of the speaker, and particularly talking about vegetables here, we have that semicolon really works there. Now in this particular case, the I behind the semicolon is capitalized, but that's because that word is capitalized anyway. So remember, you can use that semicolon to join those two closely related sentences. You wouldn't use a semicolon to join just any two sentences. Now there are two additional ways to fix a run-on. I like to say these are a little on the fancier side, but I just want to introduce you to them because even though you might not master them at this grade level, they might be something that you would do in later grade levels. So the first way to add on after those previous three would be to use a semicolon, a conjunctive adverb, and a comma. And then the last way would be to use a colon. So let's look at that fourth way. To use a semicolon, a conjunctive adverb, and a comma, we would do this to join two very closely related sentences. But not only that, but you would also do this to show the relationship between the two sentences. So now when you use a comma and a conjunction, you can show the relationship. This is a similar way to do this, but just in a different way. Now, a conjunctive adverb, if you'll look at the word, it's kind of like a cross between a conjunction and an adverb because it will connect the two sentences, but the adverb is going to give you more information. It's going to modify the relationship between the two. So conjunctive adverb is going to be basically like a transitional word, or possibly a phrase that joins two independent clauses. So a little picture representation has got some examples of some conjunctive adverbs, and we'll look at a few of these examples on the next page as well. So some common conjunctive adverbs would be additionally, also, consequently, equally, furthermore, hence, however, in addition, likewise, meanwhile, moreover, now, on the contrary, on the other hand, similarly, then, therefore, thus, and yet. Now, there may be more, but these are just some basic ones. Again, they can show, they can be equivalent to the conjunction and, like saying something that is similar. They could be similar to the conjunction but, like saying something is different or has a contrast. It could be possibly showing cause and effect. like this happened and then this happened later on, or maybe comparison and contrast. There are several different ones that you can use here. So an example of two sentences that have been joined together with a semicolon, conjunctive adverb, and a comma would be, the student misbehaved, semicolon, therefore, comma, he received a referral. So this therefore is basically a fancy way of doing a so, which would show a cause and effect relationship. And our last way to fix a run-on would be to use a colon. And the way that we would use that would be to list any additional sentence or sentences that are serving as an example, an explanation, or a clarification of the first sentence. And one example that I like to use is from a popular novel and movie, Twilight. So in the book, Bella says, about 3 things I was absolutely positive, colon. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. So I think that's a great example of how you would use a colon, in that the first part is a complete sentence, but then the sentence or sentences that come after it would give you some more explanation. So as we said when we did our punctuation unit, if you ever get done reading a sentence and you feel like there's some information that you need, some more information that you need, a colon is a great way to join those two together to make a compound sentence. All right, so let's see if we have accomplished our learning targets. I can recall the definitions of fragment, sentence, and run-on. I can identify a group of words as a fragment, sentence, or run-on. And I can recall and apply methods of fixing fragments and run-ons. So as we have that basic knowledge in our first learning target here, we'll use that as we write, or as we evaluate our own writing or others' writing, to make sure that we can identify whether something is a fragment, sentence, or run-on. And then even when we are trying to suggest to others or fix our own errors, we need to remember how to fix those fragments and run-ons to make sure that we get rid of those mistakes in our writing. So again, remember that information from writing lesson number 2 as we go out and we write, make sure that we are writing our sentences and that we're avoiding those pesky fragments and run-ons.